Thank you, everybody, for joining us. So today we're going to be talking about achieving revenue stability through your rate structure. Before we do that, I have another poll question for you all. I hope that you don't mind clicking through one more. This one is going to be asking about whether you think that your revenues last year, how did your revenues last year change? Now, if you're a water system, please respond for your water system. And if you're not, if you're a technical assistance provider or if you work for a state agency or some other organization, think about a water system that you've worked with or you've tried to help in the past few months or few years, and think about in their perspective and answer from their point of view. So I'm curious to see for a single water system what you think of, what the revenue situation was like in the past year or the last year that you were analyzing it. And Savannah, whenever it's ready to close, you can close it.
All right, getting ready to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And Shadi.
Thank you.
Yep.
Oh, I see it. So it looks like 44% or so said that the revenues were close to what was planned. A few were lucky ones, and they had more revenues than you had planned, so congratulations, that's a great year for you. But 35% said that it was slightly lower, or actually 8% said it was significantly lower last year than what you had planned. And that's not an uncommon story, as you can see just from polling here from the audience. It's pretty frequent for water systems to do the rate analysis, to set their rates, to project what the revenues need to be, and then next year happens and revenues seem to be lower than they're expecting. Thank you, Savannah. We can close this one. All right, so to start off, let's, to help define what revenue stability is in terms of this particular webinar, let's think about a water system, and this is a real-life example. A water system that has not changed its rates in 7 years. So between 2009 and 2015, the rates have been the same. Would you normally expect revenues to just kind of stay steady across those years? Because you haven't raised your rates, so you haven't changed your rates, so why would revenues change? It would be relatively steady. Or perhaps if you think that there's some growth happening in the system, you're getting more and more customers over time, more population growth, maybe you're expecting some kind of a slow increase in revenues because you have a larger customer base. Is that what it looks like in reality? And most of you have worked in this field for a while, so you know the answer is no. It looks like this, and this is, like I said, a real-life example from a water system here in North Carolina that had not changed its rates in 7 years, and their revenues went up in 1 year by 3% and went down by 6%, and it kind of stayed steady and then slowly started going back up again. So it fluctuates. The revenues did not stay, were not steady, were not stable. So when we're talking about revenue stability in this webinar, we're talking about how do you try to achieve minimal fluctuation in your revenues. How do you manage to predict your revenues and try to hit that mark every year? In this particular case, what's causing this? Why did the revenues go up 3% and then down 6% the next year? Is it perhaps because customer base decreased? People left the town. Might be the case, but if you look at the municipal population for that town, it actually grew during that time period. So even though the utility had more customers in that period, their revenue still went down, even though rates had not changed. So what is causing this fluctuation? Why did revenues change? And it could be many things. It could be that number of accounts did change, or maybe they lost a large customer. If they had an industrial customer or if they had a large commercial customer and they closed down, even if your residential population is growing, the revenues that you're generating from the commercial customers might be decreasing and you get a hit in your revenues. It could be that collection rates have changed and you're not collecting as much in 1 year as you were in other years. It could be that the number of accounts have changed, but really the most obvious answer is that the customer demands have changed. The water use patterns of your customers have changed in 1 year over the last. So why would that happen? Why would water demands go up or down? And why would water demands not go up, parallel with or correlated with the municipal population? So if the population is growing, wouldn't you expect that total water demand to also be growing? And you can see in this case it wasn't. Population went up, but total water demand went down. How is this possible? Why is it causing this? There are a lot of things that affect demand. The number of customers affect demand, the types of customers. So whether you have a lot of industrial customers or large commercial customers, your water demand changes from year to year will look very different than if your customer base is primarily single-family residential homes. Price affects demand as well, but in this particular case, price had not changed in 7 years, so that wasn't the case here. But if you raise your rates, you should expect that demands will go down slightly because customers will try to conserve and not pay as much. One of the major factors that affects demand, of course, is weather. So in some parts of the country, irrigation or outdoor watering of lawns happens typically during the summertime more frequently than the winter. Well, if it rains a lot in 1 year during the summer, then the customers might not be irrigating as much, and the water use will go down, and because water use goes down, your revenues will be affected as well. Other factors that affect demand could be the economic conditions in those years. It could be that you might be in a drought year or a water shortage year, and you've implemented conservation programs for a particular year. So those kind of initiatives that you implement will also affect demand. So there are a lot of things that affect demand, and I'm not going to be spending a lot of time today talking about demand changes. The focus today is how do the revenues and demand relate to each other? So if demand do decrease for whatever reason, how does that affect your revenues, and how can you ensure that your revenues are more stable and can weather those kind of demand fluctuations, pun not intended. So I'll focus on demand changes and how that affects your revenues and what you can do about them. The learning objectives are essentially to talk about this relationship between revenues and demand fluctuations, and to see what how sensitive demands are, how sensitive revenues are, to your demands. Demonstrate the importance of why it's important for water systems to study and to project demands and to use it in rate setting, and to make sure that you're projecting your revenues correctly, and to plan for potential revenue shortfalls. And how do you address those things? What are the strategies that you can implement to address your revenue vulnerability to demand changes? The third is to identify rate structure design options and also resources that can help water systems address revenue stability. So looking at revenues and water use, the majority of the revenues that you're getting for water systems, for most systems, come from customer charges. Now, revenues really vary from utility to utility. In terms of revenues, there are two types of systems, and I need to address that first before moving forward. There are systems that charge customers a water bill, and there are water systems that don't charge customers a water bill, like homeowner association-owned systems where it's included in rent, or apartment complexes or mobile home parks. For the systems that don't charge water bills, they may be charging, they might be getting the revenues from rent. Rent is the revenue stability that you're getting from rent is a very different picture than what I'm going to be talking about. This webinar is going to be focused on water systems that charge directly for water through water bills. And most of those systems are government-owned systems, as well as large investor-owned systems that have their rates regulated through the Utilities Commission. So those types of systems usually charge water bills. For these systems, revenue generation varies from system to system, but generally speaking, the majority of the revenues, and sometimes the vast majority of revenues, are generated primarily from the customer's sales, which means those, the revenues that you're generating from the monthly bills that you send to your customers. In some cases, that could be generating about 90% of your total revenues for your water system. The other sources of revenues could be things like fees, penalties, system development charges or impact fees, if you're renting out equipment or renting out space, other types of non-operating revenues and some operating revenues. But by and large, most systems generate a vast majority of the revenues from the month-to-month water bills, water charges that you send to your customers. And for most of the systems that we've worked with, we've analyzed data for, we found that about 80 to 85% of the revenues come from these water sales. And they come from this. This is what a typical water rate structure or water bill would look like. For most systems, there's a fixed base charge and a variable volumetric charge. A fixed base charge could be called many things: a minimum charge, a base charge, administrative charge, customer service charge. It's an amount that you charge per bill that does not change based on water use. Sometimes that includes a consumption allowance, sometimes it doesn't. So you might charge and include the first 2,000 gallons, for example. The volumetric variable charge is how much do you charge multiplied by the volume of water the customer is using. That is the total volumetric charge. So I'll show you an example. This is an example of a very simple water rate structure. The base charge here is $20 a month and includes the first 2,000 gallons a month. The customer uses less than that, they're only paying the $20. If they're using more than 2,000 gallons, they're paying that $20 per month plus $5 per 1,000 gallons for all consumption above that. This volumetric charge down here, right now, this example is showing what we call a uniform volumetric rate. You could have an increasing block rate structure, you could have a decreasing block. There are many different ways to charge and to design this kind of a rate structure. The point here that I'm trying to make is vast majority of systems that have a water bill have some variation of this typical rate structure. A base charge, which is a fixed charge, and a volumetric charge, which is variable based on how much water is being used. And the difference between the fixed versus variable is key here when we're talking about revenue stability. So what happens if a customer reduces their water use? Where do they get their cost savings, and what does that mean to your revenues? Where do you find your revenue shortfall? If a customer reduces their demand, the base charge doesn't change at all because that's a fixed fee, but the variable charge does. So this portion right here, the variable volumetric charge, is responsible for that revenue fluctuation that you're seeing whenever demand happens. So the question now is, how much of a water's revenues comes from this variable charge compared to this fixed base charge? Are you getting 90% of your revenues from your base charge and only 10% from your volumetric? In that case, your revenues are relatively stable because regardless of what the demand changes will look like, the vast majority of revenues are fixed and they won't be dependent on the water use. Or is it the other way around? Do you get more of your revenues from the variable charge than you do from your base charge? So we've calculated this for several systems. Other systems have been tracking this themselves when they're reviewing their rates every year. And I'll show you some examples of this breakdown between fixed versus variable revenues. And we're only talking about revenues at this point. So here are 3 utilities that looked at the percentage of revenues that they generated from the variable charge. And you can see that for Cary, they receive about more than 90% of their revenues came from that variable charge, and only 10% came from the fixed charge. For Durham, it started off at 80%, 82%, and dropped down to 72% when they raised their base charge. So 72% was variable, 92% for Cary was variable, 78% for Raleigh was variable. So the vast majority of the revenues that were coming to the systems were coming from these variable charges. Here are 2 more examples. This is Alameda County in California and Austin, Texas, and I know those are large systems, but this still applies to small systems too. For those 2 systems, about 82 to 85% of their revenues were coming from the variable charges, as opposed to the 15 or so % coming from the base charges. Here are examples from 2 small towns that we've been working with recently. Maysville, North Carolina, we found that 72% of their revenues were coming from variable, again, so it's very similar to those large systems, and only 28% is coming from fixed. But take a look at Reedsboro. Reedsboro in Vermont, we've calculated that their revenues, they're getting about 24% of their revenues from the variable and 76% from the fixed. So it's inverse. They're getting a lot more from their base charge than they are getting from their volumetric charge. So what's the difference between these two small water systems? And it comes down to the rate structure design. In Maysville, they have a low base charge, $7.50 per month, and then they have volumetric charges that start at 0 gallons. For Reedsboro, they have a much higher base charge, $38 per month, that includes the first 4,000 gallons. The majority of the customers, or maybe not the majority, a lot of the customers in Reedsboro were not using more than 4,000 gallons. So they end up just paying that $38 a month fixed fee. And the volumetric charges only affect a few customers that use more than 4,000 gallons. So that explains why Reedsboro is getting a lot more from their fixed charges than Maysville was. And that also means why the revenue stability for Reedsboro was a lot higher than the revenue stability for Maysville. Having said that, we found that for many water systems, perhaps even the majority of water systems, the majority of the revenues are being generated from the volumetric charges and are dependent on water use. So for most systems that we've looked at, they have that same 75% variable revenues and 25% fixed revenues. So why am I focused on this fixed versus variable difference? Why is that something to pay attention to when we're talking about revenue stability? Well, let's take a look at the expenses side, and we'll do a comparison between revenues and expenses. If customers decrease their water use, yes, revenues will go down, but won't costs also go down? I mean, why care about how much revenues will go down? If costs are going to go down, then our budget will be met anyway. The answer is yes, costs will go down, but it's not going to go down by very much. If you think about your budget and think about what you're paying for, let's break those expenses up by what's variable and what's fixed. And again, we're defining variable here as costs. In this term, it's expenses. So costs that are dependent on how much water you're selling versus how much you're going to end up paying regardless of the volume of water. So if you break down your budget and you look at your variable expenses, those are your power, the expenses for chemicals, for power. If you're buying water from another system, then the water purchase expense, and then perhaps a small portion of the maintenance cost. On the other side, when you look at the fixed costs, debt service, capital projects, payroll, billing, supplies, lab, contracts, these things they're not affected in the short term based on how much water you're selling. So if customers reduce their demands, the variable costs will go down, but the fixed costs won't. And the balance between variable and fixed on the cost side is actually quite different from the revenue side. So going back to the example of Alameda County and Austin, Texas, we said about 85% of revenues were coming from the variable. But if you look at their cost side, it's the other way around. It's about 10% or so of the expenses, 10 to 15% of the expenses were variable, and 85 to 90% of expenses were fixed. So in these cases, and this is typical of a lot of water systems, small and large, if customers reduce demands, only 10 to 15% of costs might drop somewhat, but 80 to 85% of your revenues are susceptible to decreases. So you'll see a lot more decreases on the revenue side than you would on the cost side, leading to these revenue shortfalls. Looking at the small water system, looking even at Reedsboro, Vermont, which had 76% fixed revenues, we looked at their expenses, and based on their actual expenses in fiscal year 2015, 91% of their expenses were fixed and 9% were variable. So their expenses were a lot more fixed than the revenues, even though they had really high revenue expenses. So even for that system, this discrepancy also applies. So here's another point then, that in most systems and most costs, as water use decreases, revenues will go down faster than costs in the short term, regardless of the system size. Let me ask here, I'm going to stop and ask another poll question, Savannah, if you don't mind. Thank you. So this poll question is asking how much of a revenue shortfall you think that your budget would be able to withstand. So it's measuring a little bit what your risk tolerance is. And again, if you're working with a small system, then just answer on their behalf.
And about 5 more seconds before closing the polls. Getting ready to close the poll in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like...
Nope. My apologies, that closed out. There we go.
Thank you. So it looks like 41%. Savannah, I think I'm hearing a little bit of an echo. Thank you. So 41% of you all said that you don't think that your budget could really withstand more than 5% shortfall in your revenues. 27% or 32% said even less than that you don't really have any room for error with your revenue projections. If you drop below 3% or below 97% of what you're expecting to get, that could be a significant problem for your water system. For other systems, I'm surprised, but I'm happy to hear that some systems are willing to take a 10% shortfall on revenue projections. So that means that you're working with a lot of buffer. That might mean that you have a lot of reserves, so you're able to withstand this. And we'll talk about these kind of strategies, like building reserves to withstand revenue fluctuations. Thank you, Savannah. So how much of revenues are truly variable? Going back to one of the system's examples, we said that 72% of their revenues were variable and 28% of the revenues were fixed, coming from the customer sales. The 72% variable revenues are not all entirely variable. I mean, surely not all the customers will drop to zero usage, resulting in eradicating all 72% of these revenues. Customers could reduce demand to a certain point. And the tricky question to ask is how much of the 72% might go down? If you lose all of your discretionary water use and you gain some efficiencies and your customers are using more efficient appliances, they're watering their lawns less or even maybe not at all, how much of those demands will decrease? How much of these 72% revenues will decrease? It depends on a few things. First, it depends on the rate structure design. So how are you charging? If you have an increasing block rate structure and most of your discretionary use happens on those high volumes, then these revenues will be quite vulnerable to decreases, because if they're cutting off the discretionary use, which is where you're getting a lot of your high high rates revenues, then you won't be able to charge for that usage anymore, and you lose quite a bit of these variable revenues. So the rate structure design affects it. The customer demand profile also affects it. In this particular example, the system, most of the customers were very efficient users. They were using 3,000 gallons or less. And there's not a lot of room for them to reduce their demands even further. Not a lot of customers who are out there irrigating or doing or using water, or they have a lot of water leaks or leaking toilets. So there's not going to be a lot of conservation that's happening. So even though 72% of their revenues are variable, only a small portion of that might actually be vulnerable to further decreases in demand. How weather patterns are linked to your customer demands are also could also affect the portion of the variable revenues that are actually vulnerable. Because if you're a water system where a lot of your customers are irrigating and irrigation patterns are based on weather patterns, then more of these revenues will be variable than a place that has essentially no irrigation happening in their community. So to answer this question of how much of the revenues are actually variable, It's not an easy calculation, but there are tools out there that can help you answer this. So this is a tool that's available on the Water Research Foundation's website called the Water Utility Revenue Risk Assessment Tool. And you can see the link down here, waterrf.org, and if you just search for this term, you'll find the tool. This tool is available for free for everybody. It's an Excel file that you can download, and you put in some information about what your customer demand profile looks like, so how many bills are you sending out for 1,000 gallons, 2,000 gallons, 3,000 gallons, so on, what your rate structure design is, and a little bit more information about, you know, what you're expecting demands, how you're expecting demands to change. And based on these inputs, the tool itself will calculate the portions of the revenue. So these red areas are the portions of the revenues that may be vulnerable to demand decreases. I'm not going to go into the actual graphs and explain them, but I'll be happy to talk to people. At the end of this webinar, I'll have my contact information up. And if this is something that your water system wants to do to assess how much of your revenues may be vulnerable to demand fluctuations, and you want to use this tool, I'll be happy to work with those systems in using the tool. There's another one that's also available that does that goes even further than the Water Research Foundation tool. This is from the Alliance for Water Efficiency. It's called a Sales Forecasting and Rate Model. It's kind of two models built into one. The first part of it is it looks at your customer sales, and instead of forecasting what your demands are going to be in a straight line or, you know, just in deterministic fashion, it uses some programming to look at probabilities of your demands and going up or going down, and it will run different simulations. So it will project what your revenues, it will project what your demands might look like in ranges. And using those ranges, it will help you forecast what your revenues will be. So instead of saying, I'm forecasting my revenues to be $12.1 million next year, it will come up with a model that says, it looks like we'll have an 85% chance that our revenues will be somewhere between 11.5 and 12.5 million. It's a great tool. It's available on their website. I think it's available for free for the Alliance for Water Efficiency members. But you can also contact them and they can help you use this tool. So there are tools available to help you roughly assess how much of your revenues are vulnerable to demand fluctuations. All right, so is this actually a problem? Are water systems seeing decreasing demand? I've been talking about, you know, almost with this assumption that demand is decreasing for everybody. It's not. It's not decreasing for every water system, but it is decreasing for a lot of systems. And we've looked at some studies. This is a study that looks at the AWWA and RFC's annual rate surveys, and it looked like 60% of water systems had seen decreases in their total water use between 2006 and 2012. Total water use, not average water use. The total water demands have decreased, even though populations have increased for the majority of those systems. Their total water use has gone down. This is nationally. This is an example from the state of North Carolina. Again, 59% of the systems have seen that demands have gone down in 2012 compared to 2008. This is, again, in Montana. This is average water use in Montana. You can see that it's been going down since the 80s. So there have been a lot of studies that show that for a lot of systems in the country, in many different states, water demands are decreasing. If it's not total demand decreasing, then at least it's the average demand that's decreasing. And this is coming from, there's a picture of a journal AWWA article that Rockaway and co-authors wrote in 2011 that tried to, that not just analyze the decreases in residential water use, but try to figure out what's causing it. What are the efficiencies that people are seeing from more efficient appliances or more modern appliances? Is it irrigation? Where are these efficiencies? Where are these demand reductions happening? It's a great article. It's available for free on AWWA's website. So studies upon studies have shown that water use is declining for many water systems, but not all. So I want to ask you this question about your water demands. is your water demand, your total annual water demand, is it increasing quickly? Is it decreasing? Is it stagnant? Have you looked at it? Have you not analyzed it recently? Take a moment to think about this, and I'm curious to see what the spread of results we're getting. It might be that it's increasing, and if it's increasing quickly, that means you have high growth. If you're increasing slower than expected, then you know, a lot of things might be happening there. All right.
So getting ready to close the poll in 3, 2, 1.
Wow, okay. So 43% of you said that you're seeing decreases in your water use, and 31% said stagnant. So the stagnant might be despite growth in customer service population, or maybe even decrease in service population. 17% haven't analyzed water demands, which I'm not surprised. It's not something that all systems kind of go into, but it is something that is important to do. So only 10% said that your water demands are increasing. I'm guessing this is probably skewed quite a bit towards the stagnant and decreasing because you're actually on this webinar. So this is a topic of interest for you because of the decreasing water demand. Nationally, I don't know if it looks like this, or if maybe it's not quite as severe. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so let's take a look at Seattle. Again, large system, but this is a lesson learned for everybody. For Seattle, we're showing here a graph of their total water demands since the 1930s, all the way to 2006 or 7. For a long time, their total water demand, their million gallons per day, was basically a straight line. You can just put a ruler here and then just project going forward and feel confident in your water use projections. These dotted lines here are what they actually projected in many years. So back in the 60s, they projected that demand is going to go up this way because their recent trends would look like that, and so forth. So every year they kept projecting, steady increases. That Seattle is a growing city. But starting in the mid-1990s, total demand started going down. So even though they were projecting growth, continued growth every single year, even in the mid-90s, when they were starting to see slowdown in the growth, and they were trying to be more conservative with their projections and said, all right, well, it looks like we're stagnating. They found that they were actually decreasing, and it's continuing to decrease. This is total water demand, and if you've been to Seattle, you know that that city is growing, but total water demand is decreasing. So, I mean, for a water system that faces this kind of situation, if you're not aware of your total water demand decreasing, and you're projecting continued growth or even stagnating your stagnant water demand, as you're setting your rates assuming high usage, and you set low rates to recover a certain amount of revenue. Demand decreases the next year, and you're left with a huge revenue shortfall. So it's critical for water systems to look at their water demands, at their total water demand and at their average water demand, and look at these long-term trends to see if their demands are changing the way that they are forecasting when they're setting their rates and setting their budgets. So that's really the first strategy in addressing revenue stability, is to analyze your customers' total and average water use patterns to identify these long-term trends and adjust your water use projections before you set your budgets and set your rates. So let's go over the other kinds of strategies that you could implement to address revenue stability. Number one is to improve your financial models. And we were just talking about that partially by saying at least look at your long-term demand trends and analyze that so you know that you're projecting things going forward. But more broadly, also be more conservative with your financial projections. Instead of looking at one-year financial model, look at multi-year financial models, because if you're projecting growth or if you're projecting decreases in demand, keep projecting that going forward because you'll need to see how that affects your revenues 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and adjust your rates now to address those shortfalls in the future. Analyze your water use trends, and if you are seeing decreases, factor them into your model. If you can't look at your long-term trends, if you're a new system or if you don't have enough records to analyze your water use trends, then assume worst-case scenarios when you're projecting your demands and projecting your revenues. So instead of saying, I'm going to project, last year the average use was 5,000 gallons a month, and we have 10,000 customers, so I know what my demand is next year. It's going to be 5,000 gallons a month times 10,000 customers times 12 months. There's my total use. I'm going to multiply my rate. I'm going to get $1 million next year. Instead of doing it so simplistically that way, it's very deterministically, think of your revenue, think of your water use in terms of ranges. So similar to that Alliance for Water Efficiency model, instead of saying I'm going to assume 5,000 gallons as the average, think about saying, well, it might drop. It might go to 4,500 or maybe 4,200 gallons, 4,200 gallons a month as an average. So I'm going to look at a range. I'm going to look at my water use is going to be between 4,200 gallons as the worst case scenario and 5,000 gallons, which is what I'm expecting, and project both sides of the scale to come up with a range of your revenue projections. If it's 4,200 gallons a month, what does that do to your revenues going forward? That $1 million that you need to generate, is it going to drop down to 900,000 or what are those numbers? So look at your projections. Think of worst case scenarios. Be conservative. If you're Seattle, they needed to have been conservative, and they were towards the end in the 2000s. They were being much more conservative about thinking of worst case scenarios and even further reductions than what they were actually anticipating. And then use the Alliance for Water Efficiency model if you want to test these things out in an actual model, or you can just do the analysis yourself. When I say use, try to project your water demands, you get that data from your billing records. Look at the total water sold last year, but try to parse it out between the volumes of water that are included in the consumption allowance and then those volumes that you charge volumetric rates to. So if you have, like if you were Reedsboro and you include the first 4,000 gallons in the monthly bill, you're not going to charge that 4,000 gallons a variable charge. So that piece of the demand needs to be taken out of the equation when you're calculating what your revenues will be for your water use going forward. Strategy number two is to review your rates every year. I mean, that goes without saying, but really what I'm trying to say here is don't set your rates on autopilot and leave them for several years. Things will change, water demands will change, and you need to adjust each year. As you saw in the first example, if you set your rates and you leave them there for 7 years, your revenues will fluctuate a lot more than if you were adjusting your rate on the fly. Strategy 3 is to rethink your rate structure design, and I'll talk a little bit about that in another slide, but there are multiple rate structures that can generate the same amount of revenue that you want to create for your water system. So there's not just one way to get to that $1 million that you need next year. There are many different rate structures that can get you there. But some rate structures are better than others at weathering demand fluctuations, as far as protecting the revenues from shortfalls in demand. So, for example, you might find that switching from an increasing block rate structure to a uniform volumetric rate structure might create more revenue stability for your water system. You need to analyze different kinds of rate structures. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe you can design an increasing block rate structure in a specific way that will create more revenue stability for you than other types of rate structures. How much you include in the allowance with your base charge has a strong effect or strong impact on your revenue stability. How high the base charge needs to go is also a critical component of setting rates. So we'll talk a little bit about making these kind of tweaks to your rate structure design in another slide. The fourth strategy is to consider drought surcharges. So if you are in areas that have repeated water shortage periods or repeated droughts, and you encourage customers to conserve, and then those customers conserve, and you find that you are in the revenue shortfall that year because you're not generating the revenues that you were anticipating, consider having drought surcharges. These are usually called, they're called many different things. They are essentially temporary increases to your volumetric rates. There are triggers based on reaching particular water shortage levels, or whenever you activate specific levels of your water shortage response plan. So when you are in the water shortage period, or you're encouraging conservation, automatically you have some rate increases that apply. And then when you're out of that water shortage period, those rate increases go away, and you return back to normal. By doing so, you do two things. One is you start recovering some of that lost revenue because you're raising your rates at a time when customers are reducing their demand. And then two, you're also incentivizing customers to reduce their water use because you're raising rates during a water shortage period. So it's giving them a signal to try to cut back on their water use. So it will help you with a conservation period too. To enable it, make sure that drought surcharges are permissible for your type of system or in your state. Consumption-based rate adjustments is something that investor-owned utilities may or may not have permission from the Utilities Commission to do. So at least in one state, maybe other states, Utilities Commission can allow investor-owned water systems to set rates based on historic test years, and to have automatic adjustments to the rates going forward between rate cases, so that if revenues drop below a certain specific threshold, or if water use drops below a specific threshold, automatic surcharges apply, and then whenever water use or revenues go up above a high threshold, then you have decreases in the rates that apply. So basically it's a self-correction type of mechanism, so that the utility achieves some of those revenue targets that were agreed by the Utilities Commission and the utility. Like I said, you always have to check with the Utilities Commission and see if this is even permissible in your state. So I'd advise talking to them about this. On the government side, investor-owned utilities can't really build up any reserves, but on the government-owned systems you can. And using reserves wisely is a very important strategy to addressing revenue stability. And there are many different ways to do this. One is you can create different types of reserves or different kinds of accounts to absorb the shocks to your revenues. You can call it many different things. You can call it a rainy day fund. You can call it a rate stabilization fund. So rate stabilization fund would be a type that if you have more revenues coming in a good year, so some of you said that your revenues were higher than expected, in those good years you could put some of those excess revenue into the reserve fund, so that in a future year when you have decreases in demand and you have revenue shortfalls, and your revenues are below what you're anticipating, below what you need, you can, instead of having to raise rates next year to offset these revenue shortfalls, you can just take some money out of that rate stabilization fund to compensate for it. So you build up this reserve in good years, and then you spend it down in the bad years, financially speaking, so that you don't have to adjust your rates year to year based on how water demands are changing immediately. Reducing your non-revenue water will also help you with revenue stability. I think that a lot of systems have non-revenue water is a hot topic. We do a lot of webinars on non-revenue water. If you fix your leaks, if you make sure that you're charging everybody who's using water, that you're charging correctly, that you're collecting on your bills, that you're finding and you're fixing faulty meters, do what you can to reduce the amount of water that you're treating, and then you're not charging, you're not generating any revenues from. If you address non-revenue water, you're creating more revenues for yourself, and that will help you with the revenue stability side, because instead of seeing a 5% decrease in your revenues next year by generating more revenues from reducing the non-revenue water, you could see an offset of 2 to 3% or more. And then lastly, there are also alternative rate structures that utilities could consider using that have not been implemented quite frequently yet in the water sector, but have been implemented in other sectors. So we could look to the energy sector, the telecommunications sector, other sectors, and see how they're charging customers, and see if any of these kind of rate structures apply to the water, or could apply to the water sector. We've studied some of these. We call them alternative rate structures. I have a slide later on about this. What we found is that alternative rate structures can vastly improve the revenue stability for utilities, while also reducing the charges for low-using customers and raising the charges for high-using customers. And there are ways to do this that I'll talk about in a minute. But first, let's talk about tweaking current rate structure designs to address revenue stability. The most typical ways that systems do this would be, the first thing would be to consider increasing the fixed charge, the base charge. If you increase the base charge, you might have to lower your volumetric charge so that you're not overcharging your customers. But by increasing the base charge, you're increasing that portion of your revenues that are coming from the fixed, you're increasing the percentage of the fixed revenues, therefore you're reducing your variable portion of your revenues. This does help a lot, but you also have to consider other types of trade-offs. So revenue stability is a very important thing or objective for utility to achieve, but there are other objectives that are equally important. Affordability. If you raise your base charge and you're charging 40, 50 bucks a month for 0 gallons or for 2,000 gallons, that might be a very expensive water bill for a lot of your customers, and affordability might suffer. The same thing with if you're trying to encourage conservation. If you're raising your base charge and you're lowering your volumetric rates, you're actually reducing that price signal that you're giving customers that incentivizes them to use less water. If you're trying to incentivize conservation efficiency, you're trying to show them that by doing so, they can see a significant increase or decrease in their bill. But if you raise your base charge, you're trading that off. Increasing block rate structures can exacerbate the revenue risk based on your demand profile. If you have a lot of customers using a lot of high usage water, then if you have an increasing block rate structure and you're generating about 25 to 30% of your revenues from those second and third tiers, you're much more at risk of revenue shortfalls when you do have a wet year, for example, or when demands change. So look at your increasing, if you have an increasing block rate structure, I would suggest looking at the demand profile and seeing, and using some of the tools that I mentioned earlier to calculate how much of your revenues you're generating from those discretionary usage blocks, and see if you need to adjust your block sizes or the rates that you're charging so that you're reducing the revenue vulnerability. Using larger blocks or, and especially charging, don't undercharge your first block or the low user blocks. If you're full cost pricing at the low use, then you'll be much more stable with your revenues going forward. If you're interested to see how tweaking rate structures can actually affect revenue stability, we've done a study looking at 3 different utilities available on Ceres' website or on our website. And these slides will be posted on the website. You'll be receiving an email with a link to the web page that has these slides, so you'll be able to download and find these links and find these reports. But we've looked at 3 different utilities and how tweaking the rate structure design by raising the base charge, by switching from a uniform rate to an increasing block rate, how much more are revenues going to be variable or stable. We've calculated that for 3 systems and came up with some actionable items for water systems based on those lessons learned. For alternative rate structure designs, just a brief mention, these are individualized rate structure. So each customer gets their own rate structure, each individual customer. So not just residential customers as a whole, but each residential customer gets their own customer, which is not unheard of. A lot of systems out west have budget-based rates, or they have winter average usage rates. So it's not uncommon to have customized rates. Having individualized rate structures, but the trick here is to customize the fixed charges, the fixed revenue portion of your rate, customize those based on the individual customer's water demands. We have a whiteboard. There's no time today to talk about these kind of alternative rate structure designs in detail. We might do that in a future webinar. But if you're interested to know a little bit more about these kind of rate structure designs, we have a whiteboard video that's available on the Water Research Foundation website, or you can go to our website down here and read about it in some blog posts. But these rate structure designs, what we found is, here's a graph that shows for a water system that we've analyzed this for, under their existing rate structure, a typical base charge and increasing block rate structure, they were getting the vast majority of their revenues from their variable charges, similar to what we've seen before. I think they were getting about 80% or a little bit more than 80% of their revenues from their variable charges and only 20% from their fixed charges. By switching to this alternative rate structure, particular one, we were able to generate the same amount of revenue, at least in our simulations, but instead of generating only 15 to 20% from the fixed charge, they were generating 79%, or they could have generated 79% of the revenues from that base charge. So that increases the revenue stability for that system. I mentioned some resources along the way in these PowerPoint slides, and just a couple more to let you know about. There's a guidebook that we have on our website that's called Designing Rate Structures That Support Your Objectives, and it walks you through thinking about your rate structure design, not the rates themselves, but the rate structure design, using block rates versus uniform rates, using high base charges versus low base charges. Do you include a consumption allowance or not? Those type of questions. We have a step-by-step guidebook available on our website for free for systems to use. If you're particularly interested in setting rates to encourage conservation and also address the revenue stability portion, we work with Sierra Club in Texas to create a guidebook for them in Texas, but really it applies to water systems across the country. And then again, if you're interested in learning more about these alternative rate structures, either email me or go on our webpage on our website and search for innovative alternative rate pricing or alternative pricing models to learn more about this. We have blogs. Our EFC here at University of North Carolina has an environmental finance blog, and the Environmental Finance Center Network in general has a blog specifically focused for small water systems. Here are the links for the two blogs. You can always subscribe. It's free. And I think that brings me to the end. Before I turn over to Savannah, I will also mention that as part of our cooperative agreement with EPA, we do trainings, we do workshops, we do these kind of webinars for water systems, but we can also provide free direct assistance to water systems who have 10,000 people or less, so small water systems. We can work with you directly. We can answer your questions. We can help you through using some of these resources. We can do some of the analysis for you. So if you're interested, feel free to go to our website, efcnetwork.org, and click on assistance. Or you can send me an email or phone call. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll turn it over to Savannah and see if we have any questions.
Hi, Shadi. Yes, we do. So the first question has a part A and a part B. So what kind of test year or baseline year do you use to design your rates if you develop a range of projections? Which part of the range do you use? And the second part of that is, does review rates each year mean change rates each year?
I'll answer the second one first because it's easier. reviewing rates each year does not mean that you necessarily have to change your rates. It means at least analyze it, look at your demand projections, look at your revenues. How did your revenues do last year? How are you projecting the next year? If you find that your rates are sufficient as is for what you're expecting for the coming year, you don't need to change your rates. So review is not the same thing as absolutely change every single year. But change it whenever you have to. The first question is what is the reference year? How do you analyze ranges? I don't know if this is a question coming from a government-owned system or if it's coming from investor-owned. If it's investor-owned, you have a test year. The Utilities Commission says, look at this specific year, see what your expenses were in that year, and then we'll just base off of all of our calculations to set your rates based on what your expenses were. That's a different situation than for government-owned systems. So for government-owned systems, I would look at, personally, when I look at these numbers, I like to look at a number of years, the past 2, 3, 4 years, to see trends, and then base my numbers based on, if these trends are downward, if I'm seeing that the demands are going down linearly, then I will project, I will extrapolate going forward from last year, from the most recent available data. But if I don't see a lot of trends, then the last available year is good, and then when you're generating those ranges, look at longer-term trends to kind of see how high up have demand gone or revenues have gone, how far down have they gone in the past. The good thing about using the Alliance for Water Efficiencies tool is that it automatically does all these things for you. You just plug in your information about your current rates, your water usage patterns right now, and your weather patterns, and it will simulate multiple different scenarios. It actually runs through thousands of scenarios of different demand changes based on your customer base, based on your most recent available data, and it will create those ranges for you. So it does the math for you. But if you're going to do it yourself, then I would say use the most recently available data, and then if you have some longer-term trends, apply those trends to kind of extrapolate forward. I hope that answers the question.
So unfortunately, we have exceeded our time to answer the rest of the questions, but Shadi will be able to follow up with you offline via email. Again, you can sign up for the blog or learn more about our direct technical assistance on the efcnnetwork.org website, or you can view the blog on the UNC website. Lastly, I am pushing out a survey link in the chat box. Please just take a few minutes to fill that out. You will receive that link again in the follow-up email. I just want to lastly say thank you to Shadi for the thorough presentation and detailed look at revenue stability through rate structures. And thank you to the attendees for joining us today. Shadi, would you like to add any last comments?
Just thank you for participating, and feel free to email me or call me if you have any questions, and I will be following up on any remaining questions that we've received and we haven't had time to address today. So thank you.